Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth, and today I'm actually making two videos and on issues of textual criticism. The first one that I made was on Mark 1:2, which I've already discussed in other videos, but I was just going into greater depth for those nerds of you out there who like going into greater depth on those kinds of things. There's a few of you out there that are like me on that. And then also there's the KJV-Only crowd, the ecclesiastical text crowd, the majority text crowd that likes to argue with us about those kinds of things. And so I addressed a lot of those concerns, and mostly it was to address a lot of those concerns. And I happened to get a comment on my YouTube channel, and this one I didn't really want to have time to deal with it at the time, and a lot of times when I don't have the time to deal with it right then and there, a lot of times I'll just delete the comment because I get so many. But this one, I learned my lesson from the Mark 1:2 one, because the Mark 1:2, I had received a comment about that, and I deleted that one at the time and got to thinking about, I might want to go back to that one. Well, this is one of those ones at the time I didn't have the time for it, but I decided to go ahead and just hold it in the queue so that I could, in fact, get back to it. Excuse me, I've been fighting a cold here. Well, at least the after effects of a cold. I'm not really affected as far as being able to get things done, but I've got still a fairly bad cough, and so I'm going to be coughing through the rest of this thing, so please forgive me for that. But on with the show. This is a comment, like I said, initially I didn't have time for it, but learned my lesson from other ones, decided, you know, this is something I might want to get back to, so I'll just hold it in the queue for now. Yeah, excuse me. So just hold it in the queue for now, and get around to it when I can get around to it. And just to give you a little bit of context, this was a comment that was made on my video called Breaking the Majority Text, which was a response to Robert Truelove. And some of you may already know who Robert Truelove is. He's a proponent of the ecclesiastical text, whatever exactly that is. But when I first encountered him, he was using majority text arguments. And by ecclesiastical text, he seems to kind of more or less mean majority text. And so I went ahead and showed where the majority text doesn't really stack up in accordance with history, and gave historical examples to show where certain things happen in history that make the majority text unreliable, and actually let him know that I'd done it and sent a copy to him, and his basic response was, well, that's nice, but I'm still a proponent of the majority text, is essentially what it came out to. He didn't actually have any significant responses to the material I presented. It was just, well, you're wrong because I happen to like majority text. But there was someone, as you can read up here, a day ago who decided to comment on that video, and I'll just go ahead and read the comment in full, and then we'll respond to it. His Place Christian Bookstore commented, so we're to abandon the great bulk of manuscripts produced at great cost in money and time for a handful of Egyptian texts that don't agree together. And if the papyri prove anything, it's that there were a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt. Perhaps that's why many end in a landfill. There is a proverb among economists, good money pushes out bad. The same is true with the Word of God. Excuse me. Hate this cough. The same is true with the Word of God. Why is it that the KJV is still going strong? Why have some of us abandoned the critical text and returned to the traditional text? Why do modern translations have a lifetime of at most a few decades? Say, open your additional critical text copyright page and ask yourself this question. If this is the original text of the New Testament, could it be copyrighted? So this is a person who is very much so a fan of the KJV. And so on that basis, I'm going to respond to their comments here. First thing they said was, so we're to abandon the great bulk of manuscripts produced at great cost and money and time for a handful of Egyptian texts that don't agree together. Well, I've responded to similar accusations many times in many different videos. But this particular comment shows a lot of the just the inconsistency of people who hate the critical text. They mention, this bulk of manuscripts that was produced at great cost of money and time. Well, in favor of some Egyptian texts that don't agree together. Well, like I've mentioned in other videos, the CBGM, the coherence-based genealogical method, basically further collation of the New Testament manuscripts has proven that there's no real thing as the Egyptian Alexandrian text and Western text. Instead, there's particular readings that you can use to identify manuscripts, but as far as the other readings that they'll contain, they vary enough that it's just one big old long spectrum. It's not an individual family so much anymore when it comes to those broader categories. The only true text type that really exists is the Byzantine manuscript, and that's the result of a great amount of standardization that had happened up until that point. The early manuscripts, we're finding out, don't really fit into those categories very well. So whoever is speaking of this is using old antiquated categories that critical textual scholars are leaving. It's not to say that you won't find text critical material out there that mentions them, because they had been used as designators for a long time, and so you're still going to find material that uses it. But by and large, people are realizing that the differences between the Alexandrian and, say, the Western text types are actually relatively minimal compared to the differences between say, the Alexandrian and the Byzantine, or the Western and the Byzantine. The identifiable differences are orders of magnitude between the two. But it's just so we're talking about someone who doesn't really know what's going on in textual criticism right now. And then this is a really interesting argument. These were manuscripts that were produced at great cost of money and time. Well, guess what? Every single manuscript in history took a lot of time, and also the vast majority of them took a lot of money as well. But again, this is someone who obviously doesn't know a whole lot about how manuscripts are made or textual criticism in general, because the manuscripts that they're talking about, the Byzantine manuscripts, were actually the ones that tended to be the cheaper ones to produce. They were made on, generally they were made on paper parchment, written in cursive. It's a very easy form to write in most of the time. They're called minuscules, which basically just means cursive writing. They were very easy to produce, relatively cheap to produce compared to a lot of the earlier ones. The earlier manuscripts were usually composed on either papyri or vellum, which is animal hide, which is really expensive stuff. Papyri basically has to be outsourced. Not every place grows papyri, and so you have to import it, and that makes papyri rather expensive. And then, like I said, the vellum ones, it's animal hide. You've got to go kill and skin an animal to get your writing material when it comes to those ones. So those ones are actually the ones that took more money and time to make. And in those ones, they didn't use the quick, easy cursive. Instead, they did what is called uncial form, and it took a lot of time to individually form every single one of the letters, and they tried to be very exacting with a lot of them, especially when you talk about the great uncials like Sinaiticus, more so Vaticanus, ones like that. Vaticanus, very precise writing. Took a lot more time and dedication to make the great vellum manuscripts than it did pretty much any of the later manuscripts. Like I said, the later manuscripts were basically mass-produced as far as you can do with a manuscript with something that's handwritten. So if we're saying that the ones that they put more time and effort into are the ones that are more likely to be correct, well, that's actually the earlier manuscripts that this person is decrying, not the bulk of manuscripts. The bulk of manuscripts, like I said, were kind of milled out, comparatively speaking. Yes, it was still all hand done at that particular point. That's what a manuscript is. It's something that's written by hand, but the material and the process of writing itself was much faster with that bulk of manuscripts. They were made to be mass-produced as much as you could when handwriting something. So that's, again, talking about the Egyptian text, which doesn't really exist as a category anymore. We found out that is only useful in identifying a few, you might say, marker passages, but it doesn't really identify anything else. If you talk about the Egyptian, the Alexandrian text, you're talking about a few key readings that a group of manuscripts will have in common, but it won't talk about any of the other readings. Those will be greatly divergent. So yeah, it just doesn't really, it's just not informed, talking about the Egyptian text, which doesn't really exist anymore, as a category in critical textual thought. And then talking about the great cost in money and time, the bulk of manuscripts that are out there that come from the 9th to 16th century, that's where the bulk of manuscripts come from. About 90% come from that time period. Most of them, like I said, were on parchment. It was on paper. It was relatively easy to produce compared to papyri or vellum. And the form was the minuscule writing, which again is a lot easier to write on the hand, a lot easier to use than the uncial writing that was before. So that one's just an upside down error. So one is uninformed, the other is completely upside down error. And then the whole thing, well, they don't agree together. Well, that's actually true of all New Testament manuscripts. No two New Testament manuscripts will agree on every single detail. There's some of them that agree much more than others. That's certainly true. And the Byzantine manuscripts are close enough that most of the time with them, you only have to examine a few of them to get an idea of what the vast majority of them are going to say. That much is certainly true. But the problem with that is that what you're saying is taking it just as it says in that first sentence. If they don't agree, then automatically that's a sign that it's completely unreliable. If that's your standard, the majority argument is also going to be unreliable because the majority of manuscripts don't agree perfectly. They might agree more often than the early manuscripts do, but they don't agree perfectly. If that's your standard, that's going to fail. And then this person goes on to say, and if the papyri prove anything, it's that there was a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt. If you say that they differed from each other more than the later text that was kind of run out on a mill in a very fairly standardized fashion, and that had a lot of forces of standardization working on it through history, if you mean that there's a little bit more diversity there, it's still actually not that much. Even in places where New Testament manuscripts differ, where differences occur, they will still agree at least 87% of the time. That's what we're finding from CBGN, and that's points of difference. Okay, the overall agreement of any two manuscripts is still very high, but even at points of difference, they're still the same 87% of the time. There's even those ones that do technically differ more, it's by degrees, it's not, and in the grand scheme of textual criticism, it's orders of magnitude more than the others, but in the scale of reliability and what the text actually happens to say and how much it would agree with any other random text, whether it's Byzantine or not, is usually much more often than not. Enough that the casual reader oftentimes wouldn't be able to spot the differences between them. It's only a careful eye going through actually marking out differences where you actually start seeing some of these things. But a lot of times the casual reader wouldn't catch a lot of these things, if not most of them. And if the papyri prove anything, it's that there was a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt. Like I said, if they're talking about diversity, they're actually not diverse in the sense of reliability is affected. Now, in terms of the mathematical difference between the two, there's a significant difference between early manuscripts and late manuscripts. But as far as being able to understand this as a witness of the New Testament, no. If you're going to start making those kinds of arguments, you would have to start talking about some of the Byzantine manuscripts as well, because there's a few of the Byzantine manuscripts that are kind of classified as Byzantine that actually do have some significant differences from the rest of them. And there's places where they just don't agree, where the Byzantine text tradition actually becomes widely divergent. And the most famous case where that happens, the most famous book of the Bible where that happens in extremes is the book of Revelation, where the Byzantine textual tradition is basically split. Talk about not agreeing with each other. Sometimes you'll have basically about half and half that will read one way or the other way. And at that point, a majority argument doesn't make any sense at all. But a majority argument doesn't really make any sense to begin with. And I've used this example before, and it's a good example. say that you went out and you asked people for a copy of The Little Mermaid. And some people might bring you a copy on VHS, some might bring you a copy on DVD, people might bring you a digital copy, but most people are probably going to bring you the Disney version of The Little Mermaid. Does that mean that since it's the majority of what people are bringing to you, that was the original version of The Little Mermaid? No. Historically, there's versions that come before that, going back to Hans Christian Andersen, for example. If we're comparing those two, Hans Christian Andersen versus the Disney version of Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen's version was obviously the one that came first in history. And so if we're talking about originality, that one is obviously going to be the clear winner on the basis of what actually happened in history, which actually shows up first, and which one shows up as a development. Okay, majority is not an argument that you would use in any other area of life, and yet people try to apply it to the Bible. What this tells me is that when people try to apply a majority argument to the Bible that they would not use anywhere else, the majority has decided that abortion is okay. Therefore, it must be true, right? They wouldn't use it as an argument anywhere else. What that tells me is that their standard of truth is inconsistent. That tells me that they don't believe in a God who gives us consistent ways of knowing Him and understanding Him, and just understanding and knowing the truth in general. Okay, and this is where historical biblical Protestants like myself would vastly differ with a lot of these people that are kind of more recent upstarts in a lot of ways. Historical biblical Protestants like myself have believed that the Bible is understandable through a due use of the ordinary means. No secret decoding, no special policies that we have to have over here, and special standards of truth that we have over here that don't apply anywhere else. No, it's a due use of the ordinary means. If it's a standard of truth, it's a standard of truth everywhere. And if it isn't a standard of truth everywhere, it's not a standard of truth. If it can't be complied consistently, you can't rely on it. Okay, so if I want to accept a bunch of people bringing me their copies of The Little Mermaid in the Disney version and say that this must be the original because it's the most popular, do you think I'm really going to accept the argument when it comes to something as important as the Bible? No. Alright, so papyri prove anything? It was that there was a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt. Again, yeah, they were diverse. It's true on a mathematical level, but as far as being recognizable as a version of Scripture, no, they're still recognizable as a version of Scripture that agree with each other far more often than not. That's not like one text is talking about Billy Bob and the other one's talking about Jesus. No, they're both talking about Jesus. So if it's not that, which obviously, as far as facts are concerned, it's going to be. So if this person doesn't mean that the papyri are bad in that sense, then what do they mean? And by the way, papyri don't just come from Egypt. Thought I'd point that out there. And the readings that are endemic to the papyri don't come just from Egypt. Places tended to share manuscripts. You have to remember that in Egypt there was the Library of Alexandria that would collect books from all over the world. And they happen to be preserved in Egypt because Egypt has a very dry climate, and so it tends to preserve these kinds of things better, but there's no guarantee that it only came from Egypt and Egypt only. That's not how Egypt functioned early on. Egypt, especially around Alexandria, used to be a major trade city. It used to kind of be the portal through it into a lot of Africa, but also going off into Asia as well. It was a major juncture at that time, and so you would get people coming in from all over the place. You'd get people coming in from Rome, you'd get people coming in from Persia, you'd get people coming in from Greece, you would get everyone coming through Egypt. So if you mean it's bad manuscripts because they most likely witnessed to a lot of different locations, well, no, that would be a good thing, because then we have a better idea of what the cross-section at the time was. If it had been the case that Egypt had not been a major center, and by the way, in early Christianity, Alexandria was actually a major center of Christianity. It was one of the great seas of Christianity. It was one of the stalwart places of Christianity. One of places, for example, that was strongest in its defense of the doctrine of the Trinity and other core Christian truths. Alexandria was not actually a bad place. There was lots of good, yes, there were some heretics associated with Alexandria, but there are heretics everywhere. There are also lots of really good solid people that are associated with Alexandria, like Athanasius of Alexandria, for example, and various people like that helped us in defending the core truths of Scripture, and who was very much so a scriptural theologian. The idea that there's just a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt because I say there were a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt is not something that really is historically tenable. Okay, this person thinks that there are a lot of bad manuscripts in Egypt, but hasn't really given us any due reason to believe that yet. They were bad because Egypt at the time was a major trade route, was along major trade routes, I should say. No, that's not a bad thing. That means that we have a better idea of what was coming from different places. It was a major center of learning, and it was a major center of Christian learning. Does that make it bad that a lot of Christians were there who took the Bible seriously? No. Well, there were some heretics there. Okay, well, there are heretics pretty much everywhere, so that part is relatively irrelevant, unless you can actually prove that specific heretics were associated with specific textual decisions along the way. That might be a little bit more significant, but it'd be really hard to do that. It's not like manuscripts come stamped with, I was written by heretic so-and-so. It just doesn't happen. And then this person puts on the speculation that is, I guess, supposed to be the justification for the prior statement. Perhaps that's why many end in a landfill. Well, if this person is in fact a KJV-Onlyist, I'm not sure if this person's a KJV-Onlyist, but putting forward the KJV as the English hallmark of the traditional text, whatever exactly the traditional text is, people define that differently. Some people say the traditional text is majority text. Some people say the traditional text is the text that's used in the KJV. Some people say the traditional text is one of the various forms of the Textus Receptus. There's technically multiple ones. That's Textus Recepti. Yeah, people define that variously, but this is supposed to be the justification for saying that this is why the Egyptian manuscripts are bad. It's because many end in a landfill. And it's true that a lot of papyri were discovered in landfill finds. But if this person is a KJV advocate, they would have to wrestle with the fact that there are far more KJVs that have made their way into landfills than papyri ever did. So since there are a lot of KJVs that wound up in the rubbish bin in various landfills, does that make the KJV bad? I'm just wondering where the consistency is. Okay, there's been lots of KJVs that have been thrown away. Lots of them that have been thrown away. Lots more KJVs have been thrown away than papyri. If we're going to go with a majority argument, and if we're going to go with hey, it ended up in a landfill, therefore it must be bad, well, doesn't that apply? Okay, it's not like every KJV, once it got old and unusable, they just put it in the special little glass case and tucked it away. Otherwise, we'd have a lot of glass cases by now. No, the vast majority of them were tossed. It might be a harsh reality to think of, but that's usually what happens with an old Bible. At some point down the line, it's going to get thrown away. And that's the same thing that happened with the papyri in the Egyptian landfills. At some point in history, they got thrown away. That's what happens with pretty much every book under the sun. It doesn't matter if it's the Bible or not. Okay, when we go through the Egyptian, we'll say resting places of old things, the landfills, and we happen to find business transactions. Are we assuming that those were business transactions that never really happened because what is essentially would have been the receipt for the time was thrown away? Because it was thrown away, it didn't really happen. It wasn't really an accurate account. If it was true, they would have kept the receipt forever and ever and ever. No, at some point it's going to become useless to them and they're going to throw it away. That doesn't mean that the transaction never took place, and it doesn't take place, as it said, on what was basically the then equivalent of the receipt. No. You just understand that When things fall out of use, you throw them away, and that occurs with everything. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. If you go to a landfill today and you happen to find an encyclopedia set there, does that mean that the events that are mentioned in the encyclopedia didn't happen, or that that particular encyclopedia was corrupted? Well, it mentions World War II and Hitler, but we found it in a landfill, so, it might have been making stuff up. There might not have really been a World War II. There really might not have been a Hitler. Could you really be consistent with that kind of argumentation? Landfills are just places where you throw out old things. It's not because they're necessarily wrong. It just means that they're old and substantially unusable. Okay, and that's what we find with a lot of papyri is, the back pages will be missing or the front pages will be missing. They'll have little wormholes through them where bugs ate through and those kinds of things, or they've just gotten so old that they actually start to flake. What we find is evidence that these things were really old. We don't find evidence that these things were chucked out because they were heretical. Okay, that's not why things go to a landfill. If somebody really believes that something is heretical and it's terrible and nobody should ever pay attention to it again, well, they might throw it in the landfill, but they also might just go ahead and decide to burn it instead to make sure that nobody gets a hold of it. There's plenty of things that you could do with something that's heretical that wouldn't necessarily involve a landfill. But there's plenty of reasons why ordinary things and even good things could wind up in a landfill. Mostly that they got old or unusable. And like I said, the condition that we find the manuscripts in is usually old and unusable, at least to the common person. You can't exactly just sit there with a papyri manuscript and just flip through it, because you're going to wind up tearing the pages apart. It's old and flaky and dusty and incomplete, and it's not in good shape. And all of the evidence that we have points to them being in pretty bad shape when they entered the landfill in the first place. Okay, they got old and unusable, just like an encyclopedia said. Eventually, at some point, it's going to get old and unusable, and it's going to get chucked. It doesn't mean that the things that were in it were necessarily wrong. Okay, if you happen to throw out an old dictionary, does it mean that the dictionary definitions were heretical in some way, shape, or form? No, it just means that it got old. That's one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard that could not be consistently applied to anything else in life. But people who are like this believe that the standards of truth actually are substantially different when you're talking about the Bible versus anything else. That the way that God gave us for understanding the world around us is substantially different when we're talking about the Bible versus anything else in life. When you want to know what version of The Little Mermaid was original, no one in their right mind would say, hey, everybody bring your copies here and we'll just count noses and see what the most popular version is, because everyone's going to bring the Disney version. And that's not the original. That's not the way that they're going to find that out. And somebody says, well, we found this in a dumpster. This wonderful, pretty much brand new KJV that Gideon had handed out to someone that person didn't want, and so they threw it in the dumpster, and that means that the KJV is heretical. Would anyone in their right mind use that as a standard of truth? No, it means that either the person didn't like it, or with a lot of KJVs, it's mostly that they just got old and were unusable. Lots of paperback copies of the KJV especially have made their way into landfills, because those things fall apart real quick. And you don't even have to use them that much, they'll fall apart real quick. Paperback's just not good for books. Not good book stuff. It's just an absolutely awful standard of truth that they wouldn't use anywhere else, but suddenly when it comes to the Bible, then everything's off. Okay, when you hear how God describes how we're to treat the Bible in the Bible, he treats it as something that could be understood through ordinary means. When Moses speaks to the Israelites in Deuteronomy regarding the commandments that he had just given them from God, he says, it's not in some far-off country. You don't have to climb to the highest heights or the deepest depths to get it. It's right in front of your face. The meaning is clear and obvious. You don't have to use special decoder rings. You don't have to apply a standard of truth that would not apply to anything else in order to understand this. Okay, God gave you a brain that works according to his design. You live in God's universe. If something is going to be tenable as a standard of truth, it's only going to be so because that's the way that God made it work. The reason why we have laws of logic that work consistently throughout all of our experience is because God is consistent throughout the whole of our experience. The same thing applies to how we understand the Bible. God gave us His commands, His words, in an ordinary means. Spoken and written word. A lot of it was originally spoken, written down for later generations. Ordinary means, to be understood in ordinary ways. This doesn't mean that the content is necessarily ordinary, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the inspiration thereof was ordinary, certainly not. But God gave us the tools at our immediate disposal to understand what the truth is. We don't have to create standards that we would not use anywhere else. If it is a standard of truth, it's going to be a consistently applicable standard of truth. And if you can't consistently apply it to the various cases that you might encounter, it's not a standard of truth. That's just the way truth works. But yes, that's why they end in the landfills, because they're all bad. Well, every single KJV that is not in someone's shelf right now or sitting on a museum shelf somewhere that's not in storage right now is in a landfill of one form or another. Does that mean that all those KJVs were bad? Give me a break. And then this is another one that I love. There is a proverb among economists: good money pushes out bad. I love it when people use one field of expertise to talk about textual criticism as if it somehow is applicable. I know how to pump gas, and therefore I know how to fly an airplane. What does one have to do with the other? I don't know. But I know this one thing, and so I'm going to apply it to this other thing, whether or not it fits, but I'm going to do it. There's a proverb among economists: good money pushes out bad. So how is that applicable to Scripture? Whatever becomes popular is better. The reason why you have certain forms of money excuse me, that become more popular over time and have greater staying power over time is because they have greater utility. Not because they're necessarily original. In fact, most original economic systems that have existed in various places in the world don't long survive, because the original monetary systems of a lot of places don't usually have a whole lot of utility. Barter and trade isn't necessarily bad, but sometimes what you're bartering and trading is heavy and it's hard to ship, and giving somebody cash is a lot easier. And then from cash, going to a moneyless society where you can do everything with a debit or a credit card, well, those are all issues of utility, and as far as the specific kinds of money, whether it be the US dollar or the yen or whatever it happens to be, still comes back to issues of usability, issues of utility. They don't have anything to do with originality. That's the question that's at plot and that is at play in textual criticism, was what is original, not what has become the most usable or has proven to be the most usable. So does this particular proverb actually apply to the text critical issue? No, it's a completely different question. The question of what has the best utility and the question of what is original is not the same. Like I said, in a lot of economies, you have trading, you have bullion, you have, hard monies, gold and silver, those kinds of things. They don't tend to have a lot of utility, though, and so they don't often stick around. A lot of monetary systems have transitioned out of that. Does that mean that the ones that they transitioned into were original? Of course not. Historically, that's not the case. Okay, is this actually applicable to the situation at hand? No, it isn't. Then this person says the same is true with the Word of God. So as long as it has greater utility in some way, shape, or form, that means that it's really true over what came before. I have no idea what world this person lives in, but it's not a world where they're actually addressing the key issues of concern. That much is obvious. This person says, why is it that the KJV is still going strong? Why have some of us abandoned the critical text and returned to the traditional text? Maybe because you love tradition. Why do modern translations have a lifetime of at most a few decades? Well, some of them have only existed for a few decades, so we don't know what their staying power will be. But as far as the KJV is concerned, let's go back and actually think about how the KJV came to be as popular as it was. And let's just be brutally honest about it. The KJV was a government-issued Bible. Okay, the KJV was made for the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was the state church of England. England, at the time, was an imperial power with a huge empire in many different continents, many different lands, many different regions that were under British control, under English control. And everywhere that England went, they brought their state church with them. And their state church brought the official Bible of that state church, which was the KJV. And of course, this included America, this included New Zealand, this included Australia, South Africa, tons of places. And in those places where the population by and large spoke English, the version of the Bible that they wound up using was the KJV, because that is what the government provided. We're going to go to the state church and we're going to use the state version of the Bible. And of course, a lot of the British colonies didn't take too terribly well to being colonized, and eventually got rid of the British control, such as the Americans did. When the American colonies were first set up, they were actually allied with a bunch of different nations in Europe, and eventually it fell under British control. And colonies didn't like that much. They liked being able to do their own thing their own way, and they kicked the British out. But of course, by that time, the British had been in control for a good long while. The English Empire coincides to a great extent with the Great War that they had. What is that? Was it the 100 Years' War, 150-year war? Huge, long time. Basically over a century of English expansion and empire and control and English war. But a huge period of time that the English were able to establish things, including their state churches, along with their state Bible. And so when they left, guess what people were used to? Their version of the Bible that was foisted upon them by the state. And so the KJV had been widely propagated, and because this had gone on for over a century, it became the traditional version that everyone knew and understood. And then eventually other versions of the Bible did come along, but those other versions of the Bible weren't backed by the state. A lot of the other versions that are out there are not government issued, and we don't have state churches anymore. So at that point it becomes an issue of propagation and familiarity. They're new, and so they're not very familiar, and they can't be propagated by the power of the state, and so they have to be propagated by commercial means, and that's not necessarily going to be as plentiful as when the state is issuing them and forcing people to accept them. So the reason why a lot of the modern versions don't typically last a whole lot of time, sometimes it is because honestly they're bad, and there have been some modern versions that have been absolutely terrible, and even some modern versions that have actually lasted ever since their inception that have been terrible, like the New World Translation. It's still in existence, and it's still just as heretical as it ever was. That doesn't make it any more true just because it is proven to have good staying power from its inception. Excuse me. But by and large, the reason why the KJV has become such a mainstay in English-speaking countries is because it was a government-issued Bible that had been forced upon people for over a century. let's say that we were able to erect the New World Order now, and I was able to establish an empire and dictate that all of the churches within the empire had to be government churches, and that they were all supposed to use the NLT, which I would never do because I don't consider it to be a very good translation. But let's just say that that happened in the modern age. And let's say that I got them to accept my rule and reign for over a century. I'd be an old dude by then. But let's say I'd forced this upon people for at least a century of government-issued NLTs. Well, by the end of that century of control, everyone's going to be familiar with the NLT because that's what they have. And if you come across the younger generation, the people that are there more recently, and you introduce them to the KJV, they're going to look at you like you're out of your mind, because that's not the Bible. Everyone knows that the Bible is the NLT. What are you talking about with that crazy KJV thing? And you say, no, this one's older. This one came before. This is what we had before that one. They're going to look at you and say, well, why is it that the NLT is still going strong if that KJV is so original? And that KJV is such a minority text. Everyone has the NLT now, but the KJV, there's just a few weird people who dug it up out of a basement. Everyone knows that the version that you use is the NLT. Again, that whole consistent argument thing, yeah, there's lots of people that aren't so good at that, unfortunately. All right, and then, yeah, so why is the KJV going strong? It's because it was a government-issued Bible, whereas modern versions are not government-issued Bibles. Okay, and why do modern translations have a lifetime of at most a few decades? Well, some of it is because there are bad translations, but some of it's because some of them have only existed for decades, and then there's also the fact that now Bibles have to be propagated by commercialism, and sometimes they're commercial flops because you don't have the power of the state anymore. There's lots of reasons for it, but it has nothing to do with whether or not they're more accurate or not. All right, and then this last one is great. Say, open your edition of the critical text copyright page and ask yourself this question. If this is the original text of the New Testament, could it be copyrighted? Well, if you're using the KJV as your standard of what is original, the KJV originally had, not that the copyright existed at the time, but it had basically what was the equivalent of the copyright in its day. A special license that you had to obtain in order to be able to print it, so on and so forth. Basically functioned like a copyright, but the modern copyright didn't exist back then. So does that mean that the KJV isn't the original text or doesn't represent the original text because at one point it had something that was roughly equivalent to a copyright? I'm just wondering where the consistency is. Evidently not here. And I did want to bring up one little detail here, and that is regarding the whole bulk of manuscripts idea. Yeah, it is true that the bulk of manuscripts have readings that are different from the critical texts that are now out there, but one thing I did want to point out is that the majority text changes with time. This is looking at basically the 1st century AD, and looking at the manuscripts that we have in that time frame. And we have manuscripts that go back to the 2nd century all the way up to the 10th when we're looking at the 1st millennium AD. And this graph shows the proportion of non-Byzantine, basically non-majority text, to manuscripts that would eventually wind up becoming the majority text. And that's what the light gray is. It's the non-Byzantine, the non-majority readings versus what would eventually become the majority readings. And that's the darker gray. And you can see pretty clearly that early on, through the 1st century AD, that the Byzantine manuscripts were the distinct minority. In fact, it's roughly an 80-20 split in the 1st millennium AD. That's the problem with the majority. The majority shifts with time. Okay, the majority text as you understand it wasn't always the majority text. If you want to say majority text, my next question is going to be which one? Are we talking about the majority text of the 3rd century? Because that's all non-Byzantine. Are we talking about the majority text of the 10th century, which is 314 to 121? Is that the majority, which is still non-Byzantine by majority? Which majority text are you talking about? The majority overall, that's nice, but it shifts with time. The majority of people who are living in this time period wouldn't have recognized the text that you're talking about. Are you going to say that all of those people beforehand, the vast majority of them beforehand, weren't really Christians? They didn't have real Bibles? I'm just wondering where the consistency is. Okay, or maybe you could take a little bit more reasonable position and say that, you know, all versions of the Bible that try to accurately represent the truths therein are going to do a sufficient job thereof, just by definition, and that the Bible is a text that can be understood through a due use of the ordinary means, which Protestants have historically believed. And it's why Protestants made the decisions in the text that they had available to them at the time. Early Protestants did this weird thing where they rebelled against the Catholic Church and said, instead of going with the Latin Vulgate, and it was the later version of the Latin Vulgate at that point, we're going to go to original language manuscripts, to Greek and Hebrew. Why? Because Greek and Hebrew were the original languages. And the Catholics are sitting there going, well, what we have is the majority text, and it's true even today. The Latin is the majority text. We have more manuscripts in Latin than we have for any other language version of the New Testament that's out there. And I think also for any other language version of the Old Testament as well. Latin is easily the majority text. Does that make it true? The Protestant reformers said no. Going with what the original languages have to say is going to be a better indication. Now, at the time, they didn't have a whole lot of manuscripts available to them. The King James Version of the Bible, for example, is only based on about 24 or so Greek New Testament manuscripts, and the number of Old Testament manuscripts that influenced it are even less. Like literally just a handful at best of Hebrew manuscripts that influenced its Old Testament. They didn't have a whole lot available to them. But what's really clear when you look at the arguments from a lot of the early Protestant reformers is that early on, when they were first having that conflict with the Catholics over which version of the scriptural text to use, it was pretty clear that the Protestant reformers were origionists. They believed in going back to what was more original. And had they had access, substantial access, some of the early manuscripts that we talk about of course were known at the time, but usually people didn't have substantial access to them at that point. If they had substantial access to it, all the evidence indicates that they probably would have gone for those instead, had they had substantial access to them. But it's just simply the vagaries of history that they didn't, in the same way that the vagaries of history wound up leading to the Latin Vulgate, which wasn't as accurate as the Greek version. And of course the later Greek version is not going to be as accurate as the early Greek versions. Though that's a due use of the ordinary means, which the early Protestant reformers were entirely okay with. What you're talking about is something that wound up becoming a form of Protestant traditionalism. And that's all that it is. Okay, you're using a lot of the same arguments that the Catholics tried to use against the Protestants. And if you want to be a Catholic, good, fine, wonderful. But weird thing is, the Catholics have even admitted that those arguments were bad and now have adopted a form of the critical text. If you want someone that still uses the traditional text that was then available to the Protestant reformers, the group that you really want to talk to is the Eastern Orthodox, because they're the ones that actually provided the early reformers with their Greek texts. You see, as a result of the Muslim expansion that had happened prior to the Protestant Reformation, the Eastern Orthodox basically wound up fleeing into the West, and they took their manuscripts with them, and those manuscripts is basically what became the basis for the Protestant revisions. So if you want to go back and say that the traditional text is the best, well, maybe you should consider joining the Greek Orthodox Church. That would be a consistent position to hold, and they would agree with you. And they reject thoroughly and completely the critical text. If you want a group that has had the traditional text for a good long time, not from the beginning, obviously, because you can look through their early church fathers, early Greek church fathers, and they don't use the same form of the text that they eventually wound up using. But if you want a group that's had it for a good long time and would completely agree with you and all those things, yeah, you're looking at the wrong group. Okay, if you claim to be a Protestant and you're making these kinds of arguments, it's horribly inconsistent. Protestants historically have believed in originism, going back to what was original, through a due use of the ordinary means. And if you don't do that, you're a traditionalist, which means you could be a Catholic, except even the Catholics wound up abandoning that particular form of traditionalism as it applies to the text, which means you're basically stuck with the Eastern Orthodox. So, good one to you, and I guess the Greek Orthodox Church will be happy to have you. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to a true understanding of the real Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. And as it relates to this debate, I pray that you will understand that Christianity is a real historical faith. There is no magic secret decoder ring. It's real things that happen in real history that are investable by a due use of the ordinary means. Entirely sufficient. What Moses said to the Israelites is not untrue. It's not something that you have to search the highest heights and the greatest depths for. It is available to you through consistent standards of truth that God himself stands behind. And if God himself didn't stand behind them, there wouldn't be no consistency and there'd be no point in having the discussion at all. Thank you for your time and attention, folks. Bye-bye.